All right, I think it's recording. Great. All right, finally popped up on my screen. So. Okay. So today we're going to talk about the Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools, or the EANS program, and specifically the services and assistance piece. So we've moved past the application phase, right? And kind of non-public schools had the chance to apply for the program. We produced final service amounts, and now we're at the stage where we're contracting with education service centers to provide services and assistance through this program through the remainder of the period of performance of the program, which runs till September 30th of 2023. So first thing we'll do is I'll do some introductions, and then we'll kind of go through our topics for today. So I already introduced myself. I'll introduce Karen Albel now, if Karen would like to maybe talk about what she does in the office and how it relates to EANS.
Sure. Thanks, Morgan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Albel. I'm an Assistant Director in the Office of Federal Programs, and I am leading a team that is going to be reviewing the ESSER and GEAR applications and answer any sort of programmatic level questions. And with regard to EANS, we're going to be managing the invoice process and working with you through that. So thanks for coming today, and looking forward to working with you.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. Karen's been awesome to work with, and she has a team of folks that are going to be invoice approvers. So like she mentioned there, that they would actually, you'd have a invoice approver assigned for every ESC. So that's kind of nice. You have a kind of a point person to go to. And I will also introduce now Chantel Carter. Chantel, would you like to introduce
Thank
yourself?
you, Morgan. I'm Chantel Carter, and I'm the Non-Public Equitable Services Ombudsman for the state of Ohio. My primary responsibility is to support the provision of equitable services, and normally that work is within the title grants that Morgan mentioned earlier, Title I, Title IIA, Title III, Title IV. I have supported equitable services through ESSER, and now will continue to provide support through EANS. I can support non-public schools through the process as they navigate the process, as well as answer questions that the ESC has regarding consultation. I'm one of the people that monitors the EANS inbox. So if you've sent questions there, likely you've seen a response from me. And my email, like Morgan mentioned, is on this slide if anyone needs to reach out. Thanks, Morgan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chantel. And I'll also introduce Lisa, who works very closely with Chantel as well. So, Lisa.
Hi, I am Lisa Huckins, and I am an education program specialist in the Office of Federal Programs. So I am kind of backup support for Chantel if she needs some extra help. And I also support some districts on the west side of Ohio. And my internet's a little iffy right now. So if I'm going in and out for you, I'm kind of going in and out for me too. So I apologize for that.
That's no problem, Lisa. And I just hope my internet isn't going in and out. Sometimes it does. So, but
mine never does. It just decided to today. So.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And and these are just some of our team members. You know, I'd also really like to acknowledge Candace Kirshner and Rachel Hand, who do a lot of support to our programs, and Daphne Reese also did a lot of the sort of the work on the final service amounts. So we have a full team of people that support on this program. And today we'll talk a little bit about EANS. So we'll talk about objectives for today. We'll do an overview, pretty brief, because we're kind of at a point in the process now where, you know, final service amounts have been produced. And so, you know, we want to go through that quickly, but just give you an overview of the program, kind of the role of the ESC, which for today's session, that'll be really important to just kind of establish. So what is the role of the ESC in this process? Then we'll talk about consultation. So Chantel mentioned that. What does it look like, and what does it feel like to consult with a non-public school, and you know, what steps should you take? We'll also talk about EANS services and assistance, so that the actual allowable use categories. And I'm sure you have some questions about, you know, is this particular use allowable? Is this one allowable? Hopefully we'll answer those questions for you. We'll also talk about the invoice process, and this is developed even since last week. We actually have some template documents that you can use for your invoice that we suggest for that invoice process, and hopefully be able to share screen and show that today. And then just some briefly on some additional requirements, that could come down the pike, just federal kind of requirements. So like monitoring and reporting and that kind of thing. And then just answer your questions. And we do have some pre-selected questions that we've gotten a lot in our inbox. So we'll cover those first. And then we'll open it up for everybody to ask questions as well. And if everybody could mute as well, just I'm on my share screen, so I can't help to mute everybody, but if you could mute, that'd be great, just so we don't have any background. So what are some of the objectives today? Let's summarize the program. We'll define the role of the ESC. We'll also describe the steps to actually provide those services. So going through the consultation process, determining is something an allowable expense under EANS, and then actually providing those services. And then the final thing we'll do is just identify additional requirements and kind of the next steps, and then answer your questions as we roll into July 1st and kind of the start of the EANS program, start of the contracts. So just an overview to start. So EANS is a part of the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, or CRSA Act. And if you remember, that was the second of the three big rounds of emergency funding. It was on December 27th, 2020 is when that bill came into effect, right? And it's particularly, there's a program called the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. And under that fund, so the governor has sort of some discretion on the emergency response in their states, but they carved out a specific program for non-public schools. So instead of having an equitable service amount in ESSER and one of the other emergency grants like they did in the CARES Act in the first round of emergency assistance, they instead have a whole separate section on the Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools program, or the EANS program. And the purpose of the EANS program is to provide services or assistance to eligible non-public schools to address the impact that coronavirus has had and continues to have on students and non-public students and teachers in the state. And that's important. So every activity that happens in this program should be filtered through that lens. Does it meet the purpose of the program, which is to help non-public schools address the impact that COVID-19 has had? So as you're looking at an expense, maybe the expense category, yes, it's allowable in there, but is it as a response to COVID? So you're just always filtering it through that allowable or that purpose. So on February 5th, Governor DeWine submitted a signed certification and agreement. So that's one of the steps that kind of has to happen for Ohio, for the state to receive its EANS award. That happened on February 5th, and it kind of set a number of timelines in motion. And so within 6 months, we had to obligate all of our funds for the EANS program. And that's a pretty tall order. You think of the size of Ohio, 500 and some non-public schools, very diverse typologies and needs in the state. So we had a total award of $154,896,274. And so we had to then take that and within the requirements of the program, develop methodology that we would use to first get the applications out the door and get information on the need related to COVID-19, related to low-income students in the schools, and then take that and develop. We did sort of a formula approach to our EANS program. Is everybody hearing me okay? There's a little bit of static or something in the background.
We can hear you okay, Morgan, but there is a little bit of static.
Yeah, if anybody's unmuted, if you could just mute, that'd be great. Not sure what that noise is. But so in March, we put the application out, and which involved a consultation with many stakeholder groups, but in particular the Non-Public Advisory Council, working with them and just getting feedback on our process, and got that out in March. And non-public schools applied. We had about 502 non-public schools altogether that are participating in the program. And then in May, we announced our service amounts, our final service amounts. We released estimated amounts at the beginning to get people would have an idea of about how much they'd receive if they were to apply, but you actually had to apply to the program to receive a final service amount. And so that was released in CCIP Note 469 in May. And then, since that time, we've been working with the ESCs to develop the process around this to actually provide services and assistance to non-public schools and to sign agreements, EANS agreements to provide those services. And now we have 37 participating ESCs. So it's just a great partnership. I'm really looking forward to working with our team to support the ESCs as they're providing these services. We did adjust our final amounts in early June because we decided to take the allowable 0.05% for admin costs out of this program and kind of bundle it with a couple other funding streams to be able to provide an administrative amount to ESCs of 4% of the services rendered. So the total amount, both reimbursement and services, which you'll learn about later, that's on the invoice, that are, if determined to be allowable through the invoice process, a 4% fee will be reimbursed to the ES or given to the ESC as a part of the arrangement to provide these services to non-public schools. And the final service amounts, the amounts along with the ESC that's providing services to the non-public school, the full list can be found on this link on this slide, and we'll give you these slides after the session. And you can actually, it's also on our document library, you can find it there, but you can filter by your ESC and you can actually see all the schools that you're providing services to, that you're contracted to provide services to. And so what is the Education Service Center role? Each contracted ESC will provide services and assistance to a group of non-public schools on behalf of the department and in accordance with the CURSA Act and the U.S. Department of Education guidance on the EANS program. So basically, you have a set number of non-public schools that you are ultimately responsible for providing services and assistance within the period of performance of the program. So from July 1st this year, and we'll talk about reimbursement soon, but some expenses could have occurred back to March 13th, 2020. But the effective date of the contract is July 1st of 2021 to September 30th of 2023. So that's the period you have to provide those services. In addition, each contracted ESC will assist the department in meeting all compliance, monitoring, and reporting responsibilities for provision of services and assistance to those non-public schools. So just an acknowledgement that there could be down the road some monitoring, some reporting required from the U.S. Department, but also so that we as a state have to, under the way that the program is written, have to maintain control of the funds. So similar to how a public district on traditional equitable services in Title I, for instance, or Title II, they would be maintaining control of the funds. We never kind of pay funds directly to a non-public school with federal funds. It's not really how the system works. Instead, there's a public agency that's maintaining control of those funds. And with traditional funds, that's the public district. But with the EANS program, the way it's written is the state, the department will maintain control, maintain title, property, for EANS-related services and reimbursements. And so on our behalf, the Education Service Center is contracted and will need to maintain title for the department. So, and there could be some requirements down the road in terms of U.S. Department requirements for compliance or monitoring. So in early July, the ESCs should start to consult with non-public schools that they're contracted to provide services. So it's those schools they've been contracted to provide services to. They're going to need to reach out and consult with them. And then we've provided the amounts in PDF form. We've provided the applications for EANS to the contracted ESCs. Now, in that consultation process, a non-public school might have had a new need that came up since March or when they submitted their application. they are able to amend their application or change their services as long as they are allowable services under the EANS program. So it's kind of a starting point. The applications we provided are a starting point for dialogue, for discussion, for determining EANS services. And then through consultation, the ESC will determine the means, method, manner, and process of delivering EANS services and assistance. So we will talk more about that later, but what that's really referring to is this going to be, a reimbursement? Some items are allowable for reimbursement because it could have been an expense that the non-public school incurred when the pandemic hit, right? And some of those services they could charge to this grant. It's allowable. So the ESC will ultimately determine if that's allowable, if it's something they'll submit on their invoice. Or if it's something that is only allowable through a service that the ESC has to provide from July 1st forward. And so the ESC is kind of driving that part of the consultation, but both ESC and non-public schools should be actively engaging in timely and meaningful consultation in this program. And we also acknowledge that ESCs may not provide all of the allowable EANS services in-house. So you might have like tech services or something that you don't do in-house, right? And you could therefore need to enter into a third-party agreement. The department believes that third-party agreements to provide EANS services may be allowable. And the way it's kind of phrased, the reason it's kind of phrased this way too, the U.S. Department doesn't give guidance on everything. And so one of the things that it hasn't really touched too much on is in the contract, if a state uses contracts to set up its EANS program, which many states have done that. We've talked with other states that are doing a similar thing, specifying all the requirements of that sort of is not in the frequently asked questions guidance from the U.S. Department. So we believe that it would almost be impossible for an ESC to have all these services in-house, right? And to be able to provide them all in-house. So we believe that third-party agreements may be allowable, and that's our process. And we're sticking to our process unless we were to learn otherwise. But we're sticking to our process and supporting you guys in this process. So third-party agreements, that might be an option that you have to resort to if there's a particular service that you don't provide in-house, for instance. But it's important to note that the responsibility for ensuring that EANS services are provided still falls on the contracted ESC. So if you're contracted to provide services for 20 non-public schools, that is who we're going to hold you accountable for, in terms of making sure that those services are rendered in the period of performance and all the provisions of the contract, are followed through for those schools. And we just kind of restate that here at the bottom. The ESC must provide EANS services and assistance equal to the EANS final service amount for each non-public school for which it's been contracted to provide services by September 30th, 2023. The services rendered must not exceed the EANS final service amount for the school. So you wouldn't be able to put a little bit more in this school and a little bit less than the amount in this school. You're going to want to try to, as best as possible and as reasonable amount, that the amounts at the end of the service period of performance will match up with the final service amounts provided for each school, because those were developed after an application process, right, that derive those amounts based on need. So and that's also kind of spelled out in the contract as well. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Chantel to talk a little bit more about consultation.
Thank you, Morgan.
Yeah.
Consultation is the cornerstone of the provision of equitable services. It's an open dialogue, in this case, between the ESCs and the non-public schools. This consultation, like Morgan mentioned, should be timely, meaningful, and ongoing throughout the span of the EANS program. There's a good deal of relationship building that should be happening during the consultation process. So as you start to engage in consultation with non-public schools, the first thing that you want to do is ensure that the non-public school is still eligible to receive services under EANS. So we know that at the time of submission back in March, there were several non-public schools that had applied for the second round of PPP and hadn't yet been notified or received those funds. So they could have gone ahead and applied for the EANS program. So you'll want to double check and make sure that the schools you're working with did not, subsequent to putting their application in, receive the PPP. Also, the requested services and assistance in the EANS application should be a topic of consultation. The application may include services that are not allowable under the EANS program. So, for example, during the period of time when the EANS application was open, many non-public schools were requesting services under the ventilation services and windows and submitted their applications that way. Well, during the period that our application window was open, the U.S. Department updated their frequently asked questions, and they clarified that while ventilation systems are an allowable activity, that permanent improvements to non-public schools are not allowable. So some non-public schools asked for their applications back. They emailed the EANS inbox and said, hey, we asked for new ventilation systems. We know now that's not allowable. Can we redo our application? And they did. I'm guessing that not all non-public schools that requested things like ventilation systems that aren't allowable didn't ask for those applications back. So in that consultation, you're going to be looking at things that you think may not be corona related, things that may be permanent improvements to non-public schools. Those would not be allowable. So Morgan mentioned earlier, there may be additional needs that have come up since the application was submitted. So you're kind of going to include all of that in your consultation to figure out the best way to provide services for EANS to these schools. Also, the final amounts in many cases were more than the initial amounts. So non-public schools may have been thinking, since the final amounts were released, about additional activities and services that they would like to use these funds for. So you're going to work together with them to determine alternative allowable activities and assistance that may be provided equal to the EANS final service amount. And one of the things that Morgan has said, and it's been on multiple slides, is ultimately the contracted ESC will determine the means, method, manner, and process of delivering EANS services and assistance. I've already mentioned if I can be of assistance to you as an ESC or a non-public school, feel free to send a question or get your support in the EANS inbox, and we'll follow up with you. Thanks, Morgan.
Yep. Thank you very much, Chantel. And Chantel is awesome. You know, if you haven't worked with her yet, she'll get back to you right away. She'll support, and Lisa as well. They'll provide a lot of assistance to you. And it's not just on the non-public school side. It's helping this consultation process, right? To make sure that we can figure out the best services and assistance that are needed by the school up to their service amount. So thank you very much, Chantel. And so with that, we'll kind of move into the services and assistance. And there's one big distinction that you want to start with. So there are two types of expenses that are allowable in the EANS program. There are expenses that are allowable for reimbursement, and then there are those that only can be provided as services by the ESC. So starting July 1st and forward, provided by as services. So some expenses, though, can be the non-public school may request a reimbursement. So they maybe had an expense, and these are mostly tangible items. We'll see a list of them in a second, but something like PPE or a physical barrier, right? Something that it's clear that this occurred at a particular time frame in the past, and it's an expenditure that they want to seek reimbursement. And the non-public school may be reimbursed for expenses that the school incurred on or after March 13th, 2020. They have to be obviously to prevent, prepare, and respond to COVID-19, and they must have not already been reimbursed by other federal funds. So, for instance, PPP, they couldn't charge something to two different grants, two different programs. So some of the reimbursable expenses, and like what I said earlier, that tangible items, if you look here, that's one way to kind of think this through, is these are mostly tangible items. So supplies to sanitize, disinfect, and clean facilities, personal equipment, physical barriers, material supplies or equipment recommended by the CDC to reopen and operate school facilities and to maintain health and safety, expanding capacity for coronavirus testing. Educational technology. Now, this is an area where you may see things like Chromebooks and like other types of technology that allowed the school to go hybrid or remote during the period that COVID was affecting in this last year. So these are reimbursable, right? These can go back. Now there does have to be supporting documentation on file with ESC and also maintaining the title to that with the state. So those are some complications that we might just have to work through in the invoice process. And we do have a form that I'll show you in a little bit that's called a supporting documentation form. And that form is designed to help the ESC make sure it has all the information on file that it needs, and the state as well, to approve the invoice. So that's a supportive piece, but especially around educational technology, where you're going to have to potentially inventory those, or have a way of tracking that assets that are owned by the state. A couple other reimbursable items are leasing sites or spaces to ensure social distancing. Now, if you're leasing a site or a space to expand enrollment and it's not really related to COVID, that would not fit here. But if you had to lease a modular unit to social distance, so specifically around social distancing, that would be allowable here. And we'll get into some frequently asked questions after all this as well, and kind of work through some scenarios that you guys might have questions on. In general, I would say go back to this list as you are working with your non-public schools. Keep this handy, keep it handy in your consultation, because a lot of times it may come down to a particular wording of the allowable use category here, and you have to think through, does this meet does it meet the purpose of the program, and in particular the allowable use category here. And the final one here is just reasonable transportation costs. Now, there have been some questions on this. Well, what's considered reasonable? And generally what we would say is this should be in response to COVID-19. So it may be different in different schools. In a non-public school with a really geographically dispersed area, but a lot of kids, they might be able to justify and say that it is reasonable to purchase a new bus, right? However, we also have to consider, are there options that they could have leased, or they could have fixed the bus that they had already, or whatever it is, to the most reasonable form of transportation. Now, there could be justifications that they're able to provide to the ESC to show that even a purchase is reasonable. It's not. So a lot of times there's gray areas, and it's not always just yes or no, but working through consultation to determine if something was to prepare, prevent, and respond to COVID, and if it can fit into one of these allowable use categories. So again, these are the reimbursable expenses. So these are things where you would want to ask for receipts, for documentation to show that this expenditure has occurred, and that it would fit within one of these allowable use categories. And then you're going to submit it on an invoice and request reimbursement for the non-public school to be able to reimburse them. And then the other big categories are reimbursable items, but then there's other items that are allowable through EANS, but they're not reimbursable. So they're allowable for services, but they're not reimbursable. They have to be a service provided by the ESC. And for these EANS services and assistance, they must be provided by the ESC or a third-party provider if that is determined to be the best way to provide that service. So let's just go through those really quickly. So improvements to ventilation systems, including windows. So again, wording is very important. Improvements to ventilation systems, right? Not completely new ventilation systems. So that's come up as a question, a new HVAC unit. Now, repairs to ventilation systems is fine. Improvements to ventilation systems, including windows, except for portable air purification systems, which may be reimbursed. So if they purchased a portable air purification unit, that could probably fall into one of these categories up here. Okay, the other materials, supplies, and equipment recommended by CDC for reopening, right? Probably fall into that one. So some other areas that are not reimbursable, but they are allowable, so that they have to be provided by the ESC or a third-party provider. Staff training and professional development on sanitization, use of PPE, and minimizing spread of COVID-19. Developing instructional plans, including curriculum development for remote or hybrid learning, or to address learning loss. So there could be kind of long-term learning loss needs for the school, and they would like to develop instructional plans and curriculums around that and around the new models. So as of July 1st, those services can be provided by the ESC, right, or a third-party provider, but they cannot be reimbursed. So if this already occurred in the past, this is not a reimbursable category. Similarly, in the next one, initiating and maintaining education and support services or assistance for remote or hybrid learning to address learning loss. Now, this is, I think, going to be a category that is going to have a lot of allowable uses, or a lot of uses kind of fitting into this category. So think this one through: initiating and maintaining education or support services or assistance for remote or hybrid learning and to address learning loss. So maintaining education support services is pretty broad, right? We could think of here probably teachers and tutors and maybe mental health professionals and any supports that would be needed to have a remote or hybrid learning or to address learning loss. Okay, so now keep in mind, these are all non-reimbursable items. So if it's a teacher, you can't pay for adding a teacher onto the payroll of the staff in May of last year because you, due to COVID, you can't count that. And this, unfortunately, it will not be, it's not a reimbursable category. So it has to be for services from July 1st forward. We are administrators of these funds ultimately, and sometimes we think it'd be more flexible. It probably would be more flexible for our schools if it were written a different way, but it's not. Unfortunately, this category is pretty limited. Only for services from July 1st forward would this be allowable. Would kind of teaching, tutoring, most staff roles would probably fall into this allowable use category. So it's an important one to note. And we do have lots of guidance around this that you'd be able to reference for this. And then obviously any expense that's reimbursed through a loan under the PPP prior to December 27th is you can't reimburse twice on EANS and PPP. So that would not be reimbursable. These services should be rendered by the ESC or a third-party provider. So again, reimbursements, we can reimburse as a state through the invoice process. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But for services for this category, these are going to be provided by the ESC or a third-party provider. And I will actually turn it over to Karen now to talk briefly about the invoice process. And Karen, probably we can save for the end, like the demonstration of that. And I'd be happy to help, walk through it or whatever,
Great.
but maybe just if you could introduce the invoice process to everybody.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Morgan.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we have some new documents that we just put in our document library and CCIP, the EANS invoice form and the EANS supporting documentation form. So Morgan's going to walk you through that at the end, but the invoices need to be submitted to our fiscal management inbox. And if you could also CC the EANS at education.ohio.gov invoice with each invoice request. So keep on file any supporting documentation that shows that an EANS reimbursable expenses occurred or the service has been rendered. Examples of that documentation include purchase orders, invoices, receipts, and mileage logs. And we've had a lot of questions about the ESC Administrative Fee. And the department will pay that administrative fee in an amount equal to 4% of the total services for which the ESC seeks reimbursement. And that administrative amount is calculated on the EANS invoice form and will be paid upon approval of the invoice. So my office is going to be handling the EANS invoices that come through that process. So the approval process should take between 10 and 30 days. And as always, if you have any questions about that process, just reach out through the EANS inbox located here. So I'll turn it back over to Morgan and he can show you where those documents are located and what you need to do next. Thanks, Morgan.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll probably show them just at the end, Karen, if that's cool. Just kind of get through the slides and we'll kind of get in. I also, in the other training, I didn't kind of show you where to get to the document library. I think that's a helpful thing to be able to get to in case we have future documents to add. So I'll do all that at the end. Just a couple more points before we get through these slides and be able to answer your questions as well. So control of funds, we referenced this a little bit earlier, that the CRSA Act specifies that the funds need to be controlled by the state. The department is the public agency responsible for maintaining title and property to anything purchased under the EANS program. And so the ESC is providing services on behalf of the department and must maintain control of the funds. And so there's a few ways that you'll do that. In particular, expenditures, making sure that expenditures are allowable and that the non-public school has sufficient documentation to support those expenditures, such as paid invoices. Also, that the school actually received the services or assistance related to those expenditures. So, for instance, if they submit for a reimbursable item, making sure that reimbursement, that those services occurred, that there was a date that occurred, and that you have documentation of those items. But also for services that you're rendering as well, making sure that services are rendered in the amount of the final service amount for EANS. And that the department gains title to materials, equipment, and property. And we'll show just in that invoice process, we'll show you that in a second. And then just generally, the services provided under EANS must be secular, neutral, and non-ideological. Just some additional requirements. So records, the ESC must establish, these are part of the contract as well, must establish and maintain for 3 years after the last day of the performance period. Now that's till September 30th, 2023. So you want to add 3 years onto that. Anything related to EANS, so financial reports, other information pertaining to the performance of its obligations under the contract. Reporting, we found out through the ESSER and the GEAR programs under the U.S. Department, they often they're going to require some kind of a reporting on this program. So we would just want the ESCs to be prepared to provide promptly to the department any records, documentation, or information related to the ESC's provision of EANS services and the EANS programs, and that's to be able to comply with those U.S. Department requests if there are any. And then monitoring, the department may monitor the ESC's performance and ESC's compliance with any and all requirements related to the EANS program. So again, having a process in place to ensure that monitoring these funds, that the department retains title to the goods and services, et cetera. And in general, for questions, we have 2 really good resource documents. So the frequently asked questions will give you sort of the application process, how is a school eligible, which a lot of that we've already kind of moved past that application process, but you may need to revisit, for instance, the assurances. Now the assurances are in the applications that you receive, so you're able to check them and go through it in your consultation with that school, look at their application and kind of look through it. But you may have a question on eligibility, and then, or the school may have a question for you. So this frequently asked questions document's helpful for that. It also goes into some of the kind of pre-filled questions that we have in here are straight from the frequently asked questions. So there's some very good questions that have been answered by the U.S. Department in many cases, and then questions where we've kind of also just taken it and modified it slightly to kind of have a Ohioized version of, like the questions that you're getting from your non-public school. So frequently asked questions has application process, eligibility, and allowable EANS services. And then if you're really referring to the service and assistance process, so like how do we actually consult and provide services, we have a full separate guide for that. It's the EANS Service and Assistance Guide. And that one actually has these new documents, these invoices. We already updated it online. So this link, if you go to this link, it'll actually have the new invoice forms as well. And maybe prior to the questions, I'll just kind of show you guys where the invoices are, if that works. And I can maybe even just show you where to get to them in the CCIP. So you go to the document library. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. It's over here on the left-hand side, and you go to the CCIP application. Just click Document Library. And you go to, for this program, it's under the CURSA Act. Okay, so it's the CURSA Act folder. You can see CARES Act, CURSA Act, American Rescue Plan. So we're in the kind of the second round of that emergency funding. And it's Gear 2, because this is authorized under the GEAR program, Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools. And you're going to have a full list of helpful documents for you. So some of the things on here, you see the frequently asked questions, the final service amounts. These are probably the most important document. This is the amounts that, and these are these were sent with you with the when you signed the contract as well. We sent you a return email that had the final service amounts. Service and assistance guide. We have the PowerPoint from this webinar, and then we have the invoice template and invoice supplemental documentation form. So let me show you the invoice template first. So you just downloaded it, and it's a Word version, so that you're able to modify this slightly if needed. And you can see it just looks like a typical invoice here, but we've kind of pre-populated with sort of some of the information that you'll need. Allowable uses here. You're able to then write in the allowable use categories that the ESC is requesting and the amount. Okay. And then 4% of the total as well. And I may try to update this to actually auto calculate this amount, but if not, you'll have to just kind of calculate 4% of the subtotal, right? And then the total due, you'll want to put that in here. And you'll submit this to fiscal.management@education.ohio.gov along with the EANS supporting documentation form. Okay, so that's the second document that I'll show you. And after this, if anyone has further questions, you can always email us as well or follow up with us. But you can download the second form, the supplemental documentation form. Now it does come up with a little warning, and just so you guys know, it's not corrupted or something. Our system is 20 years old. It doesn't recognize XLSX files. Unfortunately, the stuff we did in these templates, VLOOKUPs and additional formulas and stuff requires XLSX. So you're just going to hit yes here, and it'll open. And it's just this this little form here. So what you're going to do is just fill it in: the non-public school, the IRN, the category. So there's the 16 different categories. We have them listed on the invoice form, and you just can choose the category. And this is a drop down for you. So it actually lists them all out. Shout out to Rachel Hand, who did a real good job just making this more intuitive for everybody. So you can choose the allowable use category. You select whether it's a reimbursement or a service. So is this a reimbursement going back to March 13th, or is it a service that the ESC is going to provide? The date of the reimbursable expense, if it's a reimbursable expense, date of the service rendered, if it's a service. Then it's just going to be supporting documentation. So what do you have on file? Do you have receipts, purchase order? We give you a drop down on these as well, so you can choose. If you choose other, something different from invoice, purchase order, or receipt, you're going to want to just do a little description here. So just write in a description for what you have on file. Then if what you'll want to follow also as an ESC, you're going to follow, under this program, you're going to follow the State of Ohio asset policy. So if it's something that, needs to be inventoried here, needs a serial number, if it's something over $1,000, for instance, or, there's a number of other provisions in here. It's probably very similar to the asset policy you follow, but you just want to verify it just to be sure and follow your, best guidance on that. But you'll want to put in any type of unique identifier that's here if it needs to be kind of inventoried in some way. If not, you can leave it blank. And then any additional comments. This might be, let's say it's reasonable transportation costs and they purchased a van, but you think it's allowable. You think it's reasonable. You're going to maybe want to write in here a description of why you think that's reasonable, just as an additional comment for us, so we have some context. And that's the supporting documentation form, and that'll be submitted with every invoice form. So I hope that's helpful to everybody. I probably won't show this one in the non-public training just because this is more focused on the ESCs and on the work you're doing. You're going to be doing that kind of behind the scenes to to seek these invoices, request these invoices of us, and Karen's team will be reviewing those. So hope that was helpful, and we can answer questions on that in just a second too. And I'll kind of try to breeze through these questions here if that works for everybody. Oh, sorry about that. So is a non-public school that received a PPP loan prior to December 27, 2020 eligible to receive services or assistance? So yes, under EANS. If a non-public school received a PPP loan prior to December 27th, so that wasn't on the CURSA Act funding, right? This was under CARES Act or another, some kind of PPP funding that occurred prior to the CURSA Act. They can receive both PPP from before and then EANS. Now, you wouldn't want to reimburse twice for one federal expense, but they could receive it, the loan, PPP loan, and also do the EANS program. Now, if they received a PPP funding on or after December 27, 2020, they may not receive services. So any non-public school that applied for and received a loan on or after December 27, 2020 for PPP, they will not be eligible for EANS. And that's basically Congress, I think, wanted to that non-public schools would have to choose between receiving this PPP funding or receiving the EANS funding on this round of emergency funding. So this is if it's on or after December 27th. So you're going to ask it in the same way, and that's how it's written on the assurance as well. So that'll help you through as you're reading through the assurances when you're in your consultation. You'll be able to ask this question again. Just verify, hey, you guys didn't receive any PPP funding on or after December 27th, 2020. So important distinction. These are things you're going to want to do in your assurances. And may a non-public school receive reimbursement for COVID-19 related expenses? Yes, a non-public school may request reimbursement, as we've been talking about earlier. They do have to fall into those reimbursable categories, right? And they have to have been incurred on or after March 13, 2020 to prevent, prepare, or respond to COVID-19 and not have already been reimbursed with PPP, for instance, or another federal fund. Okay, so reimbursements are allowable, but only certain expenses. What's the earliest date that the ESC can provide EANS services? So direct services can be rendered as of July 1st, 2021. Even reimbursements, you can only submit the invoices sort of July 1st forward. That does not preclude ESCs from going ahead and starting planning, although now we're at June 29th, so we're getting close to July 1st anyway. So for all intents and purposes, you can start talking to your non-public schools and start initiating the consultation process. I will just note that we are going to send the final versions of the EANS agreement with signed by the department in the coming days. So that's just going through the chain right now, and those will be returned to the ESCs soon. We're hoping by July 1st, but kind of right now it's at a higher stage, and we're hoping to just get them back to you guys. But we'll provide that as well as a personalized invoice. So the one we got online is kind of a general, but we'll have one with your ESC's information on it, and we'll provide you with a return email on that for your final EANS agreement. Can IT staffing or other specialists be outsourced if the ESC cannot supply? And does the ESC have to work directly with sourcing vendors to oversee their work? So this is that third-party agreement question, right? So the department believes that the ESC may establish an agreement with a third-party provider. We recognize there's services that you may not provide in-house, right? The ESC contracted to provide services to the non-public school determines the means, method, manner, and process for EANS services and is ultimately responsible for ensuring the EANS services are provided. Okay. This is a really common question we get about staff. So the next two questions are about staff. May EANS funds be used to pay the salaries of non-public school teachers or other staff? No. Salaries, EANS funds may not be used to cover payroll. So the reason is that we have to be able to, a public agency must control the funds for the services or assistance. So that's why I think this is not a reimbursable category, that pretty much for any staff related expenses, it's likely going to fall into that initiating and maintaining education and support services for remote or hybrid learning and to address learning loss, right? That particular category is not reimbursable. So in general, can't be used to cover payroll. Instead, on behalf of the ODE, the ESC may contract with the non-public school directly, and we think they mean with the non-public teacher, in consultation with the non-public school. That's typically how that relationship works. That the ESC may contract with the non-public school directly to provide secular, neutral, non-ideological services outside of the teacher's contractual obligation with the non-public school. So it should be outside of the teacher's contractual obligation. The non-public school teacher must be employed by the ESC for EANS purposes outside of the time he or she is employed by the non-public school, and the school teacher must be under the direct supervision of the contracted ESC with respect to all EANS activities. Okay, so they're pretty clear about staff and how funding staff would occur, and that should be under the direct supervision of the contracted ESC. And similar question here, but and just kind of lays out that category where we think most staff would fall, which is initiating and maintaining education and support services. So may a non-public school charge expenses to EANS for teachers employed? Depends on what you mean by teachers employed, right? So if it is to respond to COVID and it's to address learning loss, or for a remote or hybrid learning program, and it can fall into this category, then staff may, services may be provided by the ESC, and that could be teachers or tutors, to do remote or hybrid learning or addressing learning loss. Now, under the requirements of the program, it may not be reimbursed. Therefore, the non-public school has a need, if it has a need related to remote or hybrid learning or learning loss, the service must be provided by the ESC or third-party provider. If the service is a teacher, the teacher must be employed by the ESC for EANS purposes outside of the time he or she is employed by the school. So same thing we kind of mentioned before, and under the direct supervision of the ESC. And last one we have is, are permanent improvements to ventilation systems such as HVAC systems or new windows allowable under EANS? No, and you can see our guidance. It has the statutory references on page 3, but in general, temporary improvements are allowable. So portable air purification systems are okay because the SEA can keep title to that, right? And when they're no longer needed, or when at the end of the period of performance, it could be removed. But ventilation system that has been installed as a capital improvement would not meet those requirements. We could not just, it would increase the value of the school, and we would not be able to easily remove it at the end of the performance period. So that's the distinction you want to see there is, permanent improvements are not allowable under EANS. Temporary improvements are allowable under EANS. So that's kind of a filter that you want to think through when you're doing your consultation. So is it fall under related to COVID? Is it temporary in nature? And then is it fit into an allowable use category that we listed earlier? So another example, new windows would not be permissible, but repairing old ones to facilitate airflow could be allowable. It could fall under that, improving ventilation systems. And that's all we have on here, and I'll open it up for questions. I'm sorry it's a little late. We had a little demonstration of some of our new documents, but hope this was all helpful to everybody. And I will stop sharing my screen and take some questions now.
Morgan, we've got a couple
Yeah.
from the chat.
Mm-hmm.
First, if a non-public wants to utilize teaching and support staff from the ESC, what evidence will they need to provide to demonstrate the staff is addressing learning loss associated with the pandemic?
That's a really good question. I don't think we've gotten that one yet. I would say just in general that, there's a description, a strong description of, why they're employing that teacher. So it could be, stating the learning losses that have occurred in the school, and that, this individual will be helping to address learning loss. I will say in general, the emergency grants take a very broad look at learning loss and what qualifies as addressing learning loss. So, if it was like let's say a mental health professional or someone to assist with attendance, those all could, if they had a clear justification, could help to address learning loss issues that have occurred with the. So biggest thing is that they have a justification. It makes sense, and it relates to COVID-19.
Next question. If a non-public wants to add to their application or take stuff off of it due to it not being allowable, is there a specific process for that?
No, we actually we just have the sort of the PDF applications we've provided to you guys, and from that point, it's really a dialogue and a consultation, and then using our invoice forms to actually submit for reimbursement. So we've tried to capture things in our support documentation form that will help us understand if this is an allowable request. So you don't need to do anything outside of that invoice process. So like under other contracts, you're going to submit invoices. Like when you sign that contract, then you submit an invoice for requesting reimbursement for services. So requesting for services. So you just follow that process. You don't have to do a separate application or something like that.
And the last question we had from the chat was, can you clarify the difference between employed and contracted?
Good, very good question. I think in general, if you would follow your employment policies at your ESC in terms of employment. So whatever, and we actually had a question about benefits too. That's another thing. Do we have to provide benefits? There is nothing in the law that says, or in the guidance that says whether you do or you don't need to provide benefits to someone that you're employing for that time. What it does say is for the person has to be employed for the time outside of their contractual obligation to the non-public school. So they're being employed outside of that normal contract with their non-public school directly with the ESC. So how you structure that and what employment means for your ESC probably would depend on your own policies and your own, sort of the way you've got your sort of procedures and policies in place. And then in terms of contracts as well, ultimately the ESC is responsible for providing services that are allowable under the EANS program in the amount on the EANS final service amounts. So how you structure that third-party arrangement, as long as it delivers that sort of contractual obligation of meeting a service or assistance that's allowable in the allowable use categories, how you structure that, the department believes that third-party services are allowable. So I would structure that how you do with other third-party arrangements, just like you do when you contract for other services. I'm sure you serve on a lot of grants that maybe you're not the content expert right away, and you work with another provider to provide that service. So you'd want to follow a similar process that you've already established.
A couple more questions came through. Marie asks, are instructional coaching services from the ESC allowable if it's to build the capacity of the non-public to close gaps?
That sounds like a really a good example of initiating and maintaining education and support services to address remote or hybrid learning or address learning loss. That category we've been talking a lot about. That sounds like and so that one's not exclusively staff, right? That category is anything related to learning loss. And that also might fall into curriculum development too. There's those two categories that relate to addressing learning loss. Both of them, they're not reimbursable. So the ESC does have to provide services, that they would provide the services for that. But that sounds allowable to me and would probably fit into one of those two categories. So like I said, you're going to want to keep your allowable use categories handy with you throughout consultation and be able to really see, okay, what is the nature of this request? Where might this fall in these allowable categories? And then determine the means and method. So is it reimbursable, or is this something that we would provide services directly, and kind of go from there?
Thanks, Morgan. Kristen asks, do these funds fall under uniform guidance?
So this is a contract. So you fall sort of into the procedures for contracts. It's not a grant, so you're not following all the uniform grant guidance, right? But you would follow what's in the agreements, uniform agreements section. So you do just have to maintain everything that's in the contract. So you'll want to follow through on our contract, but contracts are a little bit different from grants. So it's not like a subaward where we're doing extensive monitoring or something down the road, or we're sort of, setting up processes in the CCIP and all that. Ultimately, you're responsible for providing the services and the amount of the EANS final service amount. So the ESC can determine how they're going to do that as long as those services are provided. So you'd want to follow everything in terms of contracts that you'd be required to provide. So, and submitting your invoices through our invoice process that's the main method that you're going to, we're going to review those invoices. And if it's allowable, we'll approve it. If it's not, we'll disapprove it, and we'll make a comment there and say, hey, this is the reason we sent it back to you. So everything you're going to do is going to be through that invoice system.
Hey, Tom has a really good question about who purchases what and when. So the question is, if there are items that still need to be purchased, IT equipment, PPE, do the non-pubs submit before they purchase to get approval before they pay?
They may do that, yes. Under this program, they call it future reimbursements. That's what the U.S. Department is calling it. So they say, that a non-public school may be reimbursed for past or future reimbursements. So if it was for, something that happened in the past, they've got date stamps on it and everything, they obviously can submit for that, get a reimbursement. If it's something in the future that they're planning, if they had, purchase orders, they had something to show you how much they're gonna be spending, we can reimburse them ahead of time, and we can actually reimburse them the amount. Now you'll want to collect the documentation for that the service actually occurred, that the purchase, the expense actually occurred. So you'll want to make sure that in your consultation process, you let them know that afterwards you still need to have all the relevant documentation. But yes, future reimbursements are allowable. So it's an interesting term. But any other questions?
That's all we have right now in the chat.
Great. Yeah, and we're going to post probably both of these sessions. So the first session had probably, I would say, a few more attendees, kind of natural. That was the first one. And we had a lot of really good dialogue, and I think the question and answer session was really good. And so we're going to try to post all of these online as well. But like I said, frequently asked questions documents and a document and the service assistance guide. Those are two that you'll probably want to keep handy. And if you go to that doc library, you have all your resources right there. So let's see. Looks like Tom said last two for now. Is there a limit per item for reimbursement? And is there a list of vendors that can only be used? So there's no limit on the reimbursement, other than if you were to submit an invoice request in which one non-public school you had requested more than what they had been provided in their final service amount. So let's say they received $30,000 in their final service amount, but they requested something that was $50,000, that would not be allowable. So the only limit is the total amount for your ESC that you're providing for all your non-public schools, and then the final service amount limit for each of your non-public schools. Okay, so, but in terms of submitting on one reimbursement versus maybe submitting one every week, if you get requests every week or something, might be just dependent on how big your ESC is, how many non-public schools it's serving, the nature of those service requests. So there's no limit to that. And is there a list of vendors that can only be used? We don't have a list of vendors for this program. We have gotten a lot of feedback from non-public schools saying they have lists of vendors, and they would love, for not to work with the ESCs and through consultation to potentially use an approved vendor a vendor that they have. Now, ultimately, the ESC is responsible for the means, method, manner, and process of delivering the services. So not required to sort of use a vendor list from the non-public school, but it may be helpful. It may be very helpful because they already work with those vendors for like teaching and tutoring, for instance, or whatever it is. Now, again, it would have to be an allowable use category. It would still have to be response to COVID. But the way that you do structure those third-party arrangements, ultimately you're just responsible for ensuring the services are provided. So that's something that could come up in consultation potentially. Great. Anything else? I don't see anything else in the chat, Lisa. But it's been a good
Nothing new
discussion.
coming in, but thank you all for attending.
Yeah, thank you all so much for attending, and I look forward to supporting you and working with you. You can email the EANS inbox, and we're all on that chain. But you also have you'll have our email addresses from the start of this presentation. We have this posted online, so feel free to email any of us, and we're happy to help you out as you're providing these services. So thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day. And I'll just hang out here just for a little bit till make sure there aren't any more questions that come through. And thanks to Lisa, Karen, Chantel, everybody that came on. Looks like Sarah's on here, Beth, some of our invoice approvers.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all. Go ahead and stop the recording while we're just making sure nobody else comes through.